In the Voice of Russia World Service, welcome to another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow. We continue to acquaint you with a book by Orthodox medical psychologist and Doctor of Religious Studies Konstantin Zorin, entitled Genes and the Seven Mortal Sins. Let me remind you that the excerpt we have selected reflects on some of the spiritual and genetic aspects of intimate relations. Analyzing the correlation of genetic and spiritual aspects of the intimate sphere of relations, Konstantin Zorin stresses the following.
Sexual attraction is not yet love, just as love is by far not only limited to sexual attraction. A profound and true feeling is a gift from God. First and foremost, it presupposes a communion of the hearts, mutual rights and obligations, emotional warmth and trust. If it is reduced to just genetic and biochemical reactions, sexual fulfillment, the true meaning of marital status and family is distorted. Genes are but a biological foundation on which we build the edifice of our love, in harmony with the Lord's will, or in defiance of it.
Speaking of the unity and interaction of the genetic processes, social factors, and spiritual formation of a personality, Dr. Konstantin Zorin refers us to chapter 19 of the book of Matthew, verse 12.
For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it.
The Lord's dictum is multifaceted, says Konstantin Zorin. Thus it refers to people who are not inclined to passion simply by force of their character and sexual temperament. Their natural sexual abstention is determined genetically and cannot be viewed in the light of a feat. Others, in the name of saving their immortal soul, are forced to rein in their passionate inclinations and struggle with the sins of the flesh. The Lord highly appraises such feats. This is what Dr. Zorin goes on to say about sexual behavior.
Man himself realizes his sexual instinct. This is what we call sexual behavior. Let us repeat. The need to enter sexual contact is neither moral nor immoral in itself, just as, for example, the body's need for nourishment in the form of food. But it is quite another case when we come to the motives and means of its satisfaction. At this point, it is the free will and not the genes that are called upon to have the final say. If intimate relations do not run counter to the Gospel's commandments, the Lord's grace sanctifies them. Otherwise, there manifest themselves various aberrancies in psychosexual development, all manner of illnesses, perversions, cohabitation outside wedlock, or in other words, fornication, as well as adultery and other deviations from God's original design.
The Lord's seventh commandment reads, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." The violations of this commandment, according to Dr. Zorin, are most frequent and particularly dangerous.
Evil inexplicably lures man with its fleeting attraction, its pleasures of sin for a season. It's not accidental that the Lord told Cain, the slayer, that sin lies at the doorstep of his heart, adding, "And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him." And that the lure of sin and sexual attraction often go hand in glove. Wise King Solomon commentates this on the example of the atonement of adultery. As we read in King Solomon's book of Proverbs, "For the lips of a strange woman drop as honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell."
Let me remind you, you're listening to an excerpt from a book by Orthodox doctor and theologian Konstantin Zorin, entitled Genes and the Seven Mortal Sins.
Lust of the flesh stems from the lower, irrational part of the soul, and the dark forces seek to fan the flames of the fire. The Holy Ioann Lestvichnik warns, "Do not hope to exorcise the devil of fornication by protests or arguments, for he wields many a convincing excuse, as one fighting us with our own weakness of nature."
Possibly in no other sphere of human life do we find as many motives for sin as in that of sexual relations, states Dr. Zorin. And this is how he explains the reason for this.
Man and woman's sexual instincts and behavior patterns often take on quite distorted, sickly forms. If sexual attraction becomes excessive, it overshadows all else. The flesh is mutinous, the blood boils up, the hormones are raging, and it's extremely difficult to rein in these impulses. When passions are riding high, reason is dulled, something one comes to regret afterwards. This unbalanced, overexcited state of body and soul is aptly described in the lyrics of a popular variety song. When the love passes, reason is reunited with me. Indeed, stupefied by passions and lusts of the flesh, one loses one's head, and as such forfeits one's freedom, from now on ready for anything.
The torments of one who is ensnared by love's tender web is the central theme of many a classical work of literature. Dr. Zorin cites as an example a sonnet by Shakespeare.
My love is a fever, longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease, feeding on that which doth preserve the ill, than certain sickly appetite to please. My reason, the physician to my love, angry that his prescriptions are not kept, hath left me, and I, desperate now approve, desire is death, which physic did accept. Past cure I am, now reason is past care, and frantic mad with evermore unrest, my thoughts and my discourse as madmen's are, at random from the truth, vainly expressed. For I have sworn thee fair, and thought thee bright, who art as black as hell, as dark as night.
professor of St. Tikhon Institute of Theology in Moscow, Deacon Andrei Kurayev, wittily remarks,
"These days, when a young man says to a young girl, 'I love you,' in 90 cases out of 100, this Romeo simply wanted to tell his Juliet that he fancied her. In contemporary youth culture, 'I love you' means 'I use you.' In other words, the young man simply enjoys his sensations, using the girl to stimulate the above-mentioned feelings. This is not love, certainly, but simply another form of a human exploitation."
Dr. Zorin writes,
Besides the devil's evil tricks and our own personal, pious or otherwise views, our sexual inclinations are impacted by congenital predilections. Back in the early 19th century, the Venerable Neil lamented that the spouses beget their offspring in salacity. He said that if a child was conceived in lusty passion, he would not be a joy to his parents, since in this case the very sacrament of marriage was violated, and the Lord distances himself from the spouses. The Venerable Neil also warned of the dangers of sexual intimacy during pregnancy. He insisted that this was physically harmful to the fetus, besides being detrimental to its spiritual health. This does not necessarily mean that the child would be born with some physical defect, yet spiritually desecrated. It might acquire congenital predilections, such as cunning, penchant for lying, thievery, and such.
A similar view was professed by the famous Athos elder Paisius. He advised the spouses,
"The moment it is determined that a child has been conceived, the spouses should immediately banish all thoughts of sexual contact. If they cannot contain themselves, they ought to limit these intimate relations to a minimum, and after the 6th month of pregnancy, they ought to completely cease in any case, if the couple want to see their offspring healthy."
At this point, let me add that medical science, likewise, does not recommend sexual contact in the last 2-3 months prior to childbirth. The spiritual impact in this case isn't taken into consideration by scientific studies. What is referred to here is the development of the fetus. Konstantin Zorin writes,
"It is quite understandable that the closer the time for labor approaches, the more vulnerable the fetus is. Any awkward movement by the mother is hazardous. A pregnant woman shouldn't lie on the stomach, compress the pelvic area. Besides, coitus is accompanied by powerful emotional stress, which can weaken the pregnancy dominant."
In the 1st century AD, the Holy Clement of Alexandria similarly expressed himself regarding the pregnancy dominant. He said,
"Any excess runs counter to the laws of nature. Moses called upon the husbands to refrain from entering sexual contact with their wives until they unburdened themselves in labor. A womb intent on bearing child should not be violated by discreditable coitus. Its appetence is now entirely directed within, where, with the Lord's help, the fetus is developing. One should not disturb nature at work."
As we can see, theological and medical positions agree on this issue. The Orthodox Church severely condemns homosexuality as a mortal sin. This is not a normal sexual orientation, but rather an aberration of human nature, insists Dr. Zorin, writing,
When Athos elder Paisius was asked whether homosexuality has hereditary roots, he vehemently denied this, insisting one cannot refer the sin of sodomy to simply a quirk in the chromosomes. First of all, he said, it was the family at fault here, an erroneous upbringing, and the detrimental impact of the surrounding environment. What the elder Paisius is referring to, medical science brands as sexual perversions. They are of an acquired nature and emerge in the course of one's sexual life. The gay community tends to stress the genetic, irreversible component, insisting on congenital explanation for their sexual inclinations. Thus, they seek to establish themselves as a sexual minority that can aspire to be protected by the law. Without any doubt, spiritual, social, and biological factors impact the formation of one's sexual inclinations. Christian authors frequently stressed that the demons tempt and lure man to various unnatural sins. Similarly, at times man himself is responsible for his sexual excesses and perversions.
This is what we read in a message of the Holy Apostle Paul to the Romans.
Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them.
In conclusion of this excerpt from his book, Dr. Zorin quotes Archpriest Foma Chapko of the Orthodox Church in America, who wrote in one of his pamphlets published in 1989,
Homosexual orientation can be cured, and homosexual activity curbed. When homosexuals wanting to overcome their tendencies encounter a patient, loving concern of their friends and relatives, the Lord grants them victory over this mortal sin by means that He alone knows.
You were listening to an excerpt from the book Genes and the Seven Mortal Sins by Orthodox doctor, psychologist, Doctor of Religious Studies Konstantin Zorin. The book came off the press this year. And there we end another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow, directed by Vladimir Dyomin, editor of the text and music Tatiana Shvitsova, sound engineer Yelena Gashenikova, and your host Svetlana Yakimenko.
And Pavel Novichkov. Join us again, same time next week. All the best to you.
God save you all.